So we start in the alphabetical order with Ulrike Davy, coming from law.
I thought about what I'm going to present, and I started with reading the main title when I thought about what I could tell. The main title combines two words. One is comparing and one is change. And I thought that I should focus on change because that is the more difficult one. So I suggested we reflect on the notion of change and what sort of change is relevant for the context of the SFB. I remind us all that Rebecca Mertens, when she was making her introductory remarks, she said that where we have a lot of projects and we are dealing with all sorts of changes, what are we going to make out of all these changes? So I thought I'd give you a list. I was sitting there. I give you a list of all the sorts of changes we have been talking about over the last 2 days. And I do that in a chronological order. We were talking about a change in politics at the domestic level when Mary Morgan talked about the introduction of old age pension in the UK in a certain context, and she explained that context. Later on, she went on to a change in politics, and this time at the domestic level as well as at the global level, when she was talking about the number of people living in poverty in one country, but also in all countries over the globe. That was the context of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Then we had the change in academic institutions. There was a new institute founded, the Institute on Molecular Biology, but also Kirsten mentioned today that there have been ethnographic institutes in France. We had change in academic research. There was a new kind of method introduced when Silke Schwand was talking about digitalization, or today when Engels was talking about, the turn in comparative literature to natural science. We had a change in professional methods. I'm now referring to the panel of the doctoral researchers, and Frederick and I think it was Jakob were talking about a change in the method of the evaluation of land or buildings. We have instant changes captured in images before and after. I'm now referring to Daniel Eschkötter's presentation. We had a change in conceptualizing of the self from an entity without an agency to a person with an agency. We had a change in personal behavior. I turned from a sinner to a person that is more adhering to the commandments, or Malte was talking about the change in eating habits. We have projections in the future with respect to environmental models. We have changes in conceptualizing the world. Antje was talking about something that exists in between the creation and judgment day. So there is a closed future, but then we also imagine something with an open future. We have a change in conceptualizing the beginning of the world. Is there a single parent? Is there a creator? Or do we have to talk about parallel developments? We had talks about changes in world politics, and finally changes that accompany globalization. So I would say a pretty mess. What do we do with it? As many of you know me, I put them into order, all these things. So I think there can be two different sorts of orders. We could order these various changes from the perspective of the number of people affected, or which runs parallel, that also has spatial implications. There are changes that take place on a personal level. I am a convert. I converse from religion A to religion B. We have changes at the local or the community level. For the family, a person dies. Or when we take the level of a parish and we see a street, then there is a street without dead bodies, and then we see the street with dead bodies. We have changes at the national level. A new law is introduced. Again, I refer to the Old Pensions Act in the UK. We have changes at the world regional level. The creation of an European Institute of Molecular Biology to sort of counterbalance the US hegemony. And we have changes at the global level. And then a lot of people, of course, are affected when there is a change in anti-poverty politics. So this is, you know, the ordering according to the number of people affected or the spatial dimension. I think this is trivial. I think there should be more than this in terms of order. And you can also order the changes we have been talking about according to concepts, views, or orders. And some of the changes relate to very fundamental concepts, like the master narrative relating to mankind. There have been changes from God created the earth, or there was a very slow development taking place in nature and God is absent. We could also make out changes in, you know, morals or ethics or religion. This is what actually Max was talking about, the variations of the conception of the self. We have changes in legal orders, I mentioned a few. We have changes in societal customs or norms or cultural frames. This is like eating habits or the habits with regard to clothing. We have change in specific autonomous orders, like professional orders. Again, the changes in evaluation systems that Frederick and Jakob were talking about come to mind. So what we can see is, if we look at that from that perspective, that there are obviously some minor changes and some bigger changes. And I always understood the SFB that the SFB wants to deal with the bigger changes, which raises the question, what is a big change? Now, I would suggest that we have I think two options to opt for what is big. We could say, well, the relevant criteria is whether a lot of people are affected. Then it is big. And this is sometimes, I think, we have been talking about the global, and then, you know, it is obvious that it's big because a lot of people are affected. But again, there might be an alternative to kind of think of something big that is global, and this is turning to concepts and asking which concepts are really fundamental. And if these fundamental concepts change, then this is a relevant change for the SFB. Just to give you an idea what I think when we have such a, you know, dramatic change in concepts. I think a dramatic change in concepts occurs when the creator is sent away. Just said, well, you don't exist for us any longer. Or when there is having colonies seen as a value, and then you have another view on colonies where you consider them, having colonies, a crime against humanity. That also, I would say, is a big change. Or the belief in civilization that is then replaced by the belief that people have to save the planet, and civilization is part of the problem. This is why we have to save the planet. Or I would also say the change in concepts of the self is a big thing, because that's very elemental. But these are my, you know, my feelings about what big is. And this is when we go back to what is the problem for the SFB, then I think the SFB faces a dire question. How to get from all these piecemeal changes that I have been talking about at the beginning, how do we get from there to something that can be called, you know, a big change? Yeah? or do we have to agree on something that is big, and then all the projects kind of contribute to that big change? I think this is what I envision for the future of the SFB.
Thank you very much. Now my comment is a comment of an early modern historian. That means probably a little bit narrow-minded. I am mostly focusing on the problem of the pre-modern era and less on modern times, but probably it might be helpful also for looking on the 19th and 20th centuries. And I would like to make 3 interventions to the debate and for the open discussion. The first comment is about methods, or about the long tradition of comparative studies. In some papers, it is mentioned that probably Montesquieu was the first comparatist, or then Botero could be the first comparatist, and I can add John Fortescue from England from the 15th century, who compares England against France, political domination against the pure monarchical one, and so on. And we can all regard all these guys as first comparatists or early comparatists in a long tradition of comparative studies. But I think I would prefer to make a great difference between all these kinds of making comparison on the one hand and the scientific one on the other hand. And I would like to mention Angus Nicholls' presentation today. He calls about the people he is focusing on, that they all had their models in mind before they collect the data. In the discussion he adds that for him comparison needed a kind of open-minded thinking about the interrelation between the model and the data. That means the model is necessary and you should build models from the data, but if you have new data, you should also renew and change your model. So there's an interrelation, and in a lot of concepts we heard in the last 2 days, the model is fixed, as you told us. And the data is more or less more for rhetoric reasons than for empirical ones. So I think we should, if we are talking about such a thing like a long tradition of comparative studies, I think we should distinguish between comparison as a cultural practice that is mostly like the model is fixed and you have to find examples for rhetorical reasons, and a scientific comparative studies or comparison as a scientific method, and where you has this open interrelation between model making and empirical data. Probably that's a point we can discuss afterwards. My second intervention is I would like to bring theology back into the debate. What do I mean by that? If we're looking, for instance, for the concepts Angus Nicholls told us today morning on stadial change in civilization, I think there's a lot of theological tradition within such thinking. And I think we probably should discuss about that. And if we see all these concepts of natural determined processes, we probably also should discuss again Reinhard Koselleck's concept of an open future as a key element of a modern perception of the world. In all these conceptions, I have to say I cannot see any open future. The future is fixed. The future is fixed by the model. We don't know when the future will come or the destiny of mankind will be fulfilled, but we already know what the destiny should be. So it's very, very near to apocalyptic concepts in the Christian tradition. And that might be a good idea to think with new eyes on this sharp distinction between pre-modern traditions and modern times and so on. In very, very modern models describing the world, you can find older traditions from Christianity, from the thinking in revelation terms. And probably it's fruitful to bring this into this debate here at the end. And my third point is about one important aspect of the title, about building models to look onto or to predict future. I think if we try to look on models on predicting future in early modern times, it's probably very fruitful to look onto the esoteric tradition. That means to have the astrology in mind, or lot books, or a lot of other things, all the stuff Ulrike Ludwig is dealing about, because in early modern times, in 16th and 17th century, this kind of esoteric tradition, this kinds of trying to predict future is not a thing it's just in the center of decision making. You can see such practices by electors in Saxony, by other rulers, by members of the Privy Council, also by members of the higher clergy. So I think this could be a very interesting way of comparison to compare early modern ways predicting a future, model building of predicting future, and modern ways in including also this kind of esoteric tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. Carlos?
Yeah, I would like to pick up where Ulrike Davy has left us with these big questions in a way, and would like to talk about the contingency sensitive theory of historical change that we're about to construct here. Should it be a contingency sensitive model of historical change, maybe? So I will do two things. I will first talk about the notion of the model, kind of go back to the wonderful beginning of the conference and Mary Morgan's talk, and then I will talk about models of change. So I think we have discussed, and Ulrike has already sort of given us this sort of impressive list, really, about so many different types of change, maybe also models of change, a stadial theory, and theories of change in world politics, the rise and fall of empires, the perfectibility of civilization, evolutionary models of change, and so on and so on. And yeah, if we go back, I think we to the start of the conference, we have to ask ourselves if we need a model of historical change that is somehow related to practices of comparison. Now, to give us a short sort of reminder of what models are, I think for Mary Morgan, models are not theories, so they are styles of reasoning, and she calls them mediating instruments. She calls them technologies for investigation. I think this is a very nice term, technologies for investigation. So models are representations. They intend to represent certain epistemic objects, and they kind of construe a formal structure that more or less represents empirical relations. Does it have to be visualized? I don't know. I think we had a discussion in different contexts if models have to be visualized. I'm not so sure. I think some kind of formalization might be enough. But, and I think more, if you think about Angus's talk, you had also the visualization of the different states, right? So visualization seems to be very important to models. But if it's necessary, I don't know. Okay, so these models have a moment of selectivity to them. They omit many details of what has happened, and they represent, in a way, also a simplified version of what has happened. And what is most important, I think, in this context is that they involve certain practices of generalization. So a certain dimension of idealization and abstraction is somehow connected or important to these practices of modeling. So do we need, in this CRC, do we need a a model of historical change. I think in a way what we have done is we have kind of reconstrued how other people, historical actors, are actually modeling scientific or other types of change. So this is basically what some of the talks have done, right? Reconstruct what historically has been modeled. This is the one point, but then on the other, there comes up the question, what kind of model should we actually use, right? Is there a kind of model that we as a CRC could kind of use to actually kind of come together and work sort of in a kind of joint act on this kind of model? And Mary Morgan says, well, models are objects to inquire into. So that means there's a certain activity of building models, and in this case, kind of building a model of historical change, if you like. And then there's the second step of models as objects to inquire with. And this is the kind of heuristic dimension to the whole thing. So we use the models to understand historical change and empirical manifestations of historical change. And this whole modeling would include, I think, certain forms of abstraction and idealization that could be fruitful for us. So my question in this context really is, do we have a model of how practices of comparison play a central role in historical change? And I think we do not seem to have that. So, but it's a super interesting question, of course. And the question really is, what does change really mean? And what would it mean to have a model of historical change and to have a certain place in this model for practices of comparison? And yeah, to finish this point, I think we have a vocabulary booklet, a Vokabelheft, which is really very important and helpful, and something we can always go back to. So we have this Vokabelheft that clarifies what we mean by comparing, and I think it might make sense to have a common model, or at least some sort of very preliminary form of common model of what we think a historical change might mean, and how types of comparing maybe are connected to different process types of historical change. So I think this might be something we could talk about. And I will hand over to you, Willibald.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Much has already been said. I had the same intuition as Ulrike in looking up everything we have heard and look for how change was discussed in these papers, and I came up with almost the same list, but I would group it differently. I would group it differently, or suggest a different grouping, namely by the ways in which comparisons are related to change. And we have heard the paper by Mary Morgan, and she threw in a skeptical note about the capability of inducing political change by piling up numbers and data. So there was a very skeptical note to change, that the more numbers you have, the more data you have, the more statistics you have. That does not necessarily entail a capability for political actors to actually bring about change. It may bring about change in another way, namely perhaps even stabilizing certain institutions like rankings, etc., by this, and institutions that make these rankings. So this is certainly not the intended effect of those, and there we are with the unintended effects of those who compile the data. They are usually made for bringing political actors to make some changes, and sometimes this happens, but the main thrust of her argument, if I understood her well, was the more numbers does not necessarily bring you more knowledge, etc., needed for bringing about change if you want to do it actively, but it may have unintended consequences that are not wanted. So that was numbers. Then we had visual media, Daniel Eschkötter's talk, which I found tremendously interesting. I looked up these Maxa platform while he was talking, and looked at what they actually advertise there and what they promise to do. What you can do all sorts of things, obviously, with these images, and it's totally unpredictable what will come out of this. So, but this is a new thing. Media infrastructure comes in and opens up a whole lot of possibilities of introducing, of making political action by comparing images, by putting images one against each other and suggesting some people something must be done against this usually, or to help things out. Then we have the classical rivalry, competition, emulation, which we have already discussed in our first phase. That was the case in your papers, Rebecca and Silke, the papers where there are institutions that compete over money, over prestige, over scientific advancement, etc. That is, and sometimes there need not even be groups, but individuals who travel between the groups and learn from each other. So that is the sort of thing we discussed already in our first phase, but which is still a very powerful engine of change generated by groups comparing what they do and what they achieve with each other and trying to overtake each other. So this is still a very and then you have narratives. That was something introduced by the last talk, the last talk we had, especially by Matthias Albert and Thomas Müller. That I found also interesting, that certain ways of narrating world histories, periodization, and certain types of comparing a before and an after makes a difference in what concerning the outcome. So you have numbers, visual media, narratives, and the mechanism of rivalry or competition or emulation, which I found as some results here. So that's my grouping of this. So it's different to yours. Now a word on models. Perhaps I will throw in a little note of skepticism here, whether this is something we should actually adopt as a master concept for the SFB. I'm not yet sure about this. Let's say I'm not yet convinced that by what I've heard here, that this is something which is viable for a third phase. And the main reason is that we have heard lots of definitions of what models are, and we have, my impression was that we have talked about different things. We have talked about models that we use, as people in this SFB, as analytical procedures, or that other in certain sciences or academic procedures like DH are used by scientists. This is one thing. The other thing is that we have looked at models that enable or constrain comparisons, or are linked to comparisons in a certain way, either that they result from comparisons, from new ways that they, and that was Max Ben's thing. He Vortrag, lecture. He gave us, presented us a new way of comparing oneself to not to oneself in an earlier stage or to someone else, Jesus Christ, but to an idea which forms in yourself. And then he said there is a latent model which we can read out of Thomas von Kemp, and which then becomes a model for the Jesuits, etc., in the reception process. So there is the construction of a model in the sense of a way of thinking through a new way of comparing oneself, which is then used as a model by others and copied and imitated and so on. But then we have the other process, that there is already a model existed, and which somehow restrains or constrains comparisons. And that was discussed in your paper with Botero. You said that more or less explicitly, that he compared in a certain way. He provided a model for assessing states and countries, you said, but but this way of looking, which had a long reception history, actually constrained people making other comparisons. For example, thematizing innovation, as you said. There was a language of improvement, but not of innovation. That was his quote from you. So models that constrain certain comparisons. So that is something I found this interesting. So as I could perhaps go so far as say, if we analyze model as something which is on the meso level between the practices, the individual practices of comparison, and the sort of, well, let's call them models, one might call them differently, that are constructed by comparison, or the way in which models constrain comparisons, then that might be a useful concept. But if we mix this up with what we are doing as an analytical concept, then it becomes a conundrum. And my fear was that this was sort of mixed in the contributions we had. And then there's, of course, other meanings of model, for a model to be imitated, like a role model or something. A model to be emulated or to be imitated or to be copied, which is also a way of modeling models, of defining, let's say, defining models. So as long as we do not specify what we are talking about, then it will be difficult to use this as a concept for SFB. And the danger is, of course, if you define it too sharply, that then many projects who do interesting things about comparisons will not fit, which is extremely dangerous. Or if we define it too loosely, then the nice Gutachter will tell us this is wolkig, nebulous, I do not know what this is in English, a concept, a vague concept, and please clarify it and do that again, and meanwhile the SFB is finished. We do not want this. So these are my intuitions on model, what I had. So I stop here.
Before I give you the opportunity to answer to each other, I just want to say something, because I think that's very important, so that there is not a misunderstanding also of this conference. It's of course not so that model will be our next central term. That was never the case, yeah? So that was never meant to. What we had the idea, and I think that worked out very nicely, and I see that with all of what you said, that with the idea of models and modeling, what of course we see quite different from different time perspectives, from different topics. We have something like, it led us to talk about change and to think about change, comparison and change, comparing and change in a new way. And that, I think we talked a lot more about the connection and the interplay between change and comparing while talking about models. And that was something I was very happy with. But also to make that sure it won't be the next master term. I think we have our important terms and we have enough to do working about them. Yeah. Do you want to answer? Yeah.
I would like to ask two questions, or one question on the key term change. And my impression in listening to the presentations and also here in the summaries now about change is that in talking about change, my impression is that there seem to be two assumptions on it. The first assumption is change needs efforts, social work, shared interest, collaboration, agency. You have to do something if you want to have change. My impression was that change is presented this way here in the conference. And the second impression I have is that there's also the assumption that we as scholars have to think on concepts to understand and to explain and to interpret change accurately, and to invest more time on thinking on change than on thinking on continuity. And my provocative question on that is if it's probably not a better way to bring both terms together, change and continuity, then probably change is not the exception in history, but the normal thing, the rule. Everything changes every time. And if you want to have it in a different way, then you have to invest time to collaborate and so on, to do something for continuity in specific things. And probably it takes you more time to bring continuity within history than to look on normal changes you can see everywhere. So I think it could be a good idea not only to speak about change and to try to interpret change accurately, but always to have the problem of continuity in mind as well.
That is what our sociologists always say regarding the practice theory we have. Yeah, it's always changing. The problem is the stabilization.
That's it. That's it. I agree.
We have heard quite a lot about the ways in which comparisons bring about change or foster change, but less about stabilizing functions. May I put it that way? And this is a sort of, it is, as a theoretical question is there, but we are sort of always keen on finding change and the way in which comparisons induces change and not the other way around. But we have to probably ask these questions the harder, because it's usually we like to find changes, at least in modernity.
Probably you bring both things together, I think.
Well, I sort of disagree. That our focus is on change. When I was making the list, what is the relationship between change and comparison, I just did not go into that because I was talking too long anyway. So I think there are three different relations that can be detected in, between change and the making of comparison. Indeed, there are practices of comparing that trigger or facilitate change. This is the sort of practices of comparing Willibald was talking about. And I could also add some subcategories. Well, you have the scandalizing comparisons, you have urging comparisons, you have talk about backwardness, and then, people are pushed into doing something. You have guiding comparisons that educate someone who may be, coming back to Malte's example, should be educated with respect to what to eat, the eating habits. Or we have comparison that reveal that a concept is inconsistent and that the concept has to be changed accordingly. But this is only a small part of comparison we are dealing with. We're also dealing with comparisons that actually hamper change. They also exist. These are, in my case, and I pay attention to them, but I don't find very many. But they use a certain mechanism. Scandalizing comparisons, which is what I deal with, they scandalize the present and they make you want to change the present. Comparisons that hamper change horrify the future. They would say, no, if you engage in change, you will lose everything you have. This is the beautiful example that Antje was talking about, Botero. You lose your reputation, you lose your honor, you lose all the subjects that you have, they will revolt. So do not engage in change. And then there's a second category of comparison that actually hamper change. And these are comparisons that kind of indicate that change is not possible. I meet these sort of comparisons when I read racist literature contending that, these people out of Africa, they have a skull that is so little. They're so little. Whatever we do with them, they will never civilize. So then why should I engage in change? Because they cannot be changed anyway. So trigger or facilitate, hamper change, but also simply practices of comparing that accompany change, that just are illustrative. They don't want to kind of trigger change or hamper change, but they sort of accompany this. They make change visible. They're harmless.